degree to which, in some ways, labor management is not strictly a labor and management issue, but it's a larger issue for the society and all the other players that came into it. You know, when you look at it that way, it's hard to think about how you bring about kind of change in the short term or even the medium term. It looks much more like a long-term proposition.
Well, you're talking about social attitudes, which is critical. And when you have the leading politicians in Tennessee, the governor, the senator, a number of other politicians, actively campaigning against a union vote, which interestingly enough, European management, Volkswagen being a German company, was not only accepting of the union vote, but in fact encouraging it. And even after the vote was taken and there was this narrow defeat of unionization, the manager at Volkswagen in Chattanooga said, well, we still want to push ahead and have a German-style works council. I mean, here you have a concept of management on the part of the German managers that they want to have labor representation in order to deal with issues such as pay, hours, safety, hiring, firing, that kind of stuff. Whereas the political attitude is unions are in the way. Worker representation is in the way. Let management deal directly with the workers. Well, when the management dealt directly with the workers in Bangladesh, it didn't pay any attention to their safety whatsoever. And what is disturbing is that the American companies which were buying products from those Bangladesh factories, which technically had programs that were supposed to monitor the safety of the working conditions in plants in Bangladesh or China or elsewhere in Asia, it turned out that when people looked at them very carefully, they weren't being very aggressively pursued. The oversight wasn't being aggressively pursued. It got into the area of costs. So if you've got a management that is focused exclusively on the bottom line, you've got a problem when safety is going to cost you something and nip into that bottom line. And then when you get into the problem you've just raised, if domestically the attitude is in many states, so-called right-to-work states, and Tennessee is one of them, that labor unions are bad and forcing workers into unions and even holding union votes are a deterrent, as the governor suggested, a deterrent to further expansion of industry in the state. I don't know how you get the public then concerned about worker safety in a place as distant as Bangladesh. If you're not going to be taking care of if you're not going to let the workers in your own state encourage them to organize and represent themselves, I don't know how you're going to have worker interests in a distant country be in the forefront of the mind of consumers. I mean, we've gotten to the point here where there are only two yardsticks by which we measure things. Consumers measure them by price. Is the price the lowest possible price I can get? And executives and CEOs manage things by what's the maximum profit I can get. In other words, money is in the yardstick. And we don't just have the problem with Bangladesh. And we're coming up now to this whole issue of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, trade partnership that the Obama administration is negotiating. And there are trade unions and others that are very concerned that issues of worker safety are not going to be built into those trade agreements. And they look back at what happened with the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement with Canada and Mexico, or at the trade agreement with South Korea, or some of the Central American agreements, and they say, look, government policy, not just public attitudes, but government policy is not pushing issues of worker safety and not forcing the same kind of safety conditions in those other countries as a part of our agreement as we insist at home. So this is an imbalance. This is not a level playing field. This is going to work to the advantage of low-cost foreign suppliers. It's going to cause American distributors, retailers, marketing distribution companies to go overseas for production because their labor costs are lower, in part because their worker safety protections are much more lax than ours are. And this is now written into policy. So we're talking, Tom, when we're talking about this issue of worker safety, we're talking about a whole shift in public attitudes and corporate and even political attitudes that's taken place over the last 3 decades, and you're talking about reversing that. That's a big struggle. I mean, this is a major problem that the Boston Global Forum has taken on. I applaud the forum for doing it. These are really important issues, but they're going to be tough, and they're going to take a long time to confront.
Well, there's been very little transparency, as you know, around the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations. Very large possible trade agreement between the United States and other countries that share the Pacific. At the same time, the Obama administration has said they're looking for, quote, a 21st century trade agreement, meaning one that's really forward-looking, one that's very progressive, one that might include much more substantial protections of workers than have some of the past trade agreements, and also environmental protections. You know, I don't think we know exactly what that's going to look like. You're suggesting it's probably going to come out more closer to the bottom than kind of the more optimistic projections on the TPP would suggest.
Well, the risk here is that as long as the negotiations are handled in private, and as long as the administration is pushing for fast-track approval in Congress, which is essentially an up or down vote, it means that there's very little chance for outside parties, whether they're environmental groups, labor groups, consumer groups, or just plain other legislators who are concerned about various issues that affect industries in their particular area. There's very little opportunity to both question it and also challenge it at a time when the substance of the trade agreement can be affected. And it seems to me, once again, there's sort of a lockout against these other concerns, against these other issues. If we were thinking about just today, worker safety, then why not have the portions that deal with worker safety in this Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership negotiation made public, so that people can say, is that a reasonable position? Is that a standard we want to live by? I mean, this is a huge trade agreement. Most of the others have been bilateral, so they've affected trade with one other country, and a couple have affected, you know, 2 or 3 countries. But this is a huge trade agreement between the United States and an entire region in the Pacific, multiple countries. That's got to be negotiated right. It's going to become a precedent for lots of other agreements. Perhaps the agreement we're negotiating also with the Europeans, although in the case of the Europeans, their worker protections are generally better than ours and more vigorously enforced. We're not a country that has vigorously enforced labor working conditions they're written already into our laws. I mean, OSHA has been pretty effective, but when you look at the H-1B visa problem, that is foreigners who are hired by Americans, companies to work in America, people from India, people from the Philippines, Russia, Ukraine, elsewhere around the country, there's supposed to be a standard that they can't be hired unless it's clear there's no American available with equivalent skills. Well, the enforcement of that law has been lax ever since it was passed in 1990. There have been multiple reports to Congress about that. Here we're talking about, we're not even talking about worker safety abroad. We're talking about the protection of college-educated, knowledge economy, professional jobs in this country. And the worker protections there for the American employees have been lax, weakly written into law, and weakly enforced. So, I mean, there are, again, I'm trying to get at this notion that my book I call it Who Stole the American Dream. It's not just economics, it is also the conditions under which people are working. It's been deteriorating in this country over 3 decades. Jacking it up overseas is going to be tough if we can't take care of the home front very well.
Rick, thank you very much. Governor, do you have any comment or question for Rick?
Well, I wonder, Rick, whether, in view of what you said, and it's really quite accurate, it is a time at least to think seriously about some kind of international agreement which sets minimum standards and enforces them. Because, as you point out, at this point, it's a mixed bag. Our friends in Europe seem to be taking this more seriously in some ways, although some of the American companies are involved, and I think want to do the right thing. But as long as there's a place where you can do this on the cheap without these kinds of standards, people are going to gravitate there. And this will well be a case where, as in the case of environmental standards, we need some kind of international framework within which all companies are expected to meet decent minimal standards when it comes to what's going on in the workplace.
I couldn't agree more, Governor. I think you're absolutely right. And there is a framework. I mean, the World Trade Organization, the WTO, is set up. It's set up for trade agreements. But worker safety standards are rarely brought up. I mean, there's a lot of concern for protection of copyright and patent and protection of financial services and the flow of capital. Maybe this is where the big political influence is, certainly in this country, but also in other countries as well. But yeah, I mean, we do need some international standards, or exactly what you said is going to happen. The same thing happens in the tax arena. You finally have, it's interesting, you finally have the G20 starting to talk about an international tax regime. Will probably take a decade to generate it, maybe more, so that you can't have companies running around finding tax havens. Well, if they can address that kind of an issue on taxes, then why not address a similar issue on either worker safety conditions or environmental concerns? I mean, if the G20 starts moving in that direction, that seems to me it makes a lot of sense, because as long as we're split up nationally, people are going to try to divide and conquer and beggar their neighbor and find the cheapest, least demanding environment for producing their goods, or at least getting the goods they want to sell.
In fairness to the administration, apparently there are some provisions in this Trans-Asia agreement that the president wants fast track on, which focus on both environmental and occupational safety and health standards. I don't know them in detail, but one of the arguments that the administration is making on this is that for the first time, really, these provisions are included in the agreement, but it does seem to me that unless there's some kind of international framework in which, with enforcement, in which all companies in all countries, frankly, are expected to meet standards, that you're going to have this continuing problem.
Well, I would like to be optimistic about what the administration has said about the labor and environmental portions of the negotiations. This is not the first time we've been told that by a sitting administration about a trade agreement that was being negotiated. I mean, back at the time of NAFTA, there were concerns raised about some of these same issues, and the Clinton administration assured us that in fact labor standards and environmental standards were being considered. In the ultimate result, the standards were pretty weak, and it's happened subsequent to that too. But I hope you're right. But the test really, Governor, it seems to me, would be for them to come out and be public about it. If there was something that would, of course, it's difficult when you're having multinational negotiations to reveal things at every stage of the game. That's a formula for getting nowhere. I can understand that, but maybe there ought to be periodic benchmarks where you've got a preliminary draft. You know, this happens with federal agencies all the time. We have a big dispute going on now in this country about the IRS issuing regulations on how to determine whether or not tax-exempt organizations are actually engaged in politics or not. Right? They've drafted a bunch of rules. They put them out for public comment. There are all kinds of comments from both left and right. People are unhappy. But before they issue the rules, they go through that. Well, why can't that be done in a trade negotiation? Once the rules are drafted, you bring them out and you go back and you redraft them. It can't go on forever, but at least it gives people a chance to measure just how seriously the effort is being made, and gives people like the Boston Global Forum and people who support these objectives a chance to weigh in and say, yeah, that's really good what you're doing there. We like that. Or that's not adequate, and we need to let people know and organize and put some pressure on various governments to tighten up the standards and do better by the workforce.
Rick, thank you very much. This has been very helpful, and we can't thank you enough for participating this morning in the Boston Global Forum. Next, we're going to hear from Marcy Goldstein-Gelb, the Executive Director of MASCOSH, which strives to promote worker safety, security, and health, largely in this area of Massachusetts. And MASCOSH works very closely with professionals, with unions, with community groups in trying to seek these goals for workers. Marcy.